The sun was hot on the perfectly cut lawn of the Caldwell Estate in Lagos, Nigeria. It baked the cheap suitcases and boxes scattered across the grass. Elara Vance stood perfectly still, watching her life, the last 3 years of it, being thrown out piece by piece. Julian Thorne watched her from the cool, shaded marble porch. He wore an expensive shirt and looked satisfied but cold. He didn't look sad or sorry. He looked like a man finishing a boring job. His mother, Beatrice, was thrilled. "The nerve," Beatrice hissed, grabbing a framed photo of Elara and Julian off a box. She tossed it onto a heap of towels. She really thought she belonged here. "Like poor people win the grand prize, Julian." A small crowd of neighbors had gathered across the street, watching the mess. Most held up their phones, recording the show they set up to make her look bad. Elara could feel their staring and judging. The crew leader, a big man in a sweaty shirt, brought out the last item, a simple antique cedar chest that had belonged to Elara's grandmother. He put it down gently. "That's everything, Mum," he told Elara, careful not to look at Julian. Beatrice walked down the porch steps, her silk dress flowing, and stopped right in front of Elara. She was a large woman, built on a lifetime of being rich and spoiled. "Just so you know how badly you failed, Elara," Beatrice said, whispering loudly enough for everyone to hear. She raised her hand and delivered a sharp, stinging slap across Elara's cheek. "That's for wasting my son's time. You came from nothing, and now you go back to it." The slap was loud enough to quiet the watching crowd. Julian winced, but only slightly. Elara didn't touch her face. She didn't cry. She didn't even blink. She stood very still. It was unsettling. She only held one thing, a worn leather folder pressed tightly to her chest. Julian finally moved. He walked down the steps and stopped next to his mother. He pulled a thick wad of cash from his wallet. "Here," he said, holding the money out to Elara like he was talking down to her. $500 for your trouble. Go buy a new dress and maybe a bus ticket." It was a planned insult, meant to humiliate her one last time. Elara looked at the cash, then at the man she married. She did not take the money. "Don't touch the boxes," Julian snapped at the neighbors. "They belong to her." A balcony door slid shut above them. Sienna, Julian's very pregnant mistress, stood there in a bright yellow dress. She lifted a champagne glass in a fake toast, her eyes shining with spite. Elara turned her back on them all, Julian, Beatrice, Sienna, and the recording phones, and walked toward the waiting taxi. She didn't look back at the Caldwell Estate. She just walked away, clutching her folder, the slap still burning on her cheek, a faint hidden smile at the corner of her mouth. The yellow taxi pulled away, leaving a swirl of dust on the paved street. Elara watched the Caldwell Estate shrink in the rearview mirror. It was a massive, imposing structure, a monument to wealth and lineage that Julian had pretended was his. She knew better now. The driver glanced at her in the mirror, clearly sensing the drama she was fleeing, but he said nothing. He only asked for the address. Elara settled back into the worn vinyl seat. The physical sting of Beatrice's slap was fading, replaced by a hollow, quiet ache that had nothing to do with emotion and everything to do with patience. Patience was the greatest lesson her grandmother, Vivian Caldwell, had ever taught her. Vivian had raised Elara in a small, clapboard house in rural Ogun State. It was a life built on simplicity, dignity, and hard work. The house was tiny, but it was filled with books and the scent of homemade tea. Vivian never spoke about the past, only the future and the present task at hand. "Grace isn't weakness, baby girl," Vivian used to say, her eyes sharp and knowing. "Fighting gives your enemy energy. Silence makes them overplay their hand. And real power doesn't need to announce itself." Elara had taken those words to heart. She learned to observe, to listen, and to hold her counsel. This inner quietude had protected her through the chaos of her marriage and the public spectacle of her eviction. 5 years ago, Vivian had passed away. In the final hours, she had pressed a small, heavy gold locket into Elara's hand. "Open this, but not until the time is right," Vivian had whispered, her voice frail but firm. "You will know the time. It is your legacy, and it is a map." Elara had worn the locket faithfully for years, but never opened it, remembering her grandmother's strict instruction. It was a beautiful, simple piece, heavy with the history of the Caldwell family, though Elara never knew that history at the time. She met Julian 2 years after Vivian died. He was charming, ambitious, and utterly convinced of his own superiority. He swept her off her feet with promises of a grand life. He was a man who loved the idea of a quiet, elegant wife from a modest background, thinking she would reflect his success without ever challenging him. 2 years into their marriage, Julian had announced a major career triumph. "We're moving," he'd declared, standing on the balcony of their cramped downtown condo. "I closed the biggest deal of my life. My company is granting me use of a property, rent-free, as a bonus. It's huge." He'd driven her out to the sprawling, historic mansion, the Caldwell Estate, and handed her the keys with a flourish. "Welcome home, darling. You deserve this." Elara had taken the keys, but her eyes had been drawn to the wrought iron gate, where the name Caldwell was subtly forged into the design. A familiar name, the same as her grandmother's. It was a coincidence she couldn't ignore. The first 2 years in the Caldwell Estate had been a slow, uncomfortable process of adjustment. Elara tried to make the huge rooms feel like home, but the house always felt cold, ancient, and resistant to her touch. Julian treated the place like a high-end hotel room, a stage for entertaining clients and boasting about his supposed success. Elara, remembering the name on the gate, started doing research. The estate was legendary in Lagos, a bastion of old Nigerian wealth, built generations ago by one of the region's wealthiest black families. The history was rich, detailed, and utterly unconnected to Julian's family tree. He was a Thorne. This was the Caldwell legacy. Her research was slow and frustrating. The online records were sparse, focusing more on the architecture than the ownership lineage. Julian was increasingly cold, preoccupied with long, late nights at the office and shorter tempers at home. Elara suspected the marriage was failing long before she saw the first strange text message on his unlocked tablet. 3 months ago, a minor crisis had broken the dam of her grandmother's instruction. Julian had thrown a vase, not at her but in her direction, smashing against a wall in a fit of manufactured rage over a burnt dinner. The violence wasn't physical, but it was a deliberate breach of safety. That night, lying alone in the vast, echoing master bedroom, Elara sat up. The time is right. She reached for the gold locket around her neck. It felt heavy, a single solid piece of metal. Her fingers worked at the seam, a tiny indentation hidden beneath the decorative etching. With a soft click, it opened. It was not a picture locket. Inside, folded several times into a minute square, was a slip of aged, brittle paper. Carefully, Elara unfolded it. Scrawled in Vivian's neat, sloping handwriting were 3 simple lines: 14 Lekki Gardens, Drive, Lagos Trust, account VC keep silent. Elara stared at the address. The cold chill of the room suddenly felt like a wave of pure shock. 14 Lekki Gardens Drive. It was the address of the Caldwell Estate, the mansion where she was currently sleeping. The house Julian claimed was his company's bonus property. She felt a dizzying mix of disbelief and vindication. Vivian had never mentioned the house, never hinted at wealth. Everything about the locket, the timing, and the secrecy suddenly felt less like a mysterious family heirloom and more like a carefully crafted map designed for a specific moment. Elara knew she couldn't face Julian with this information. She needed proof, legal backing, and a strategy. She needed a lawyer. She closed the locket, the metallic click sounding louder than a gunshot in the silent room. She finally understood her grandmother's words. The quiet ones are the ones who can wait for the perfect moment. The next morning, Elara made a discreet call. She scheduled an appointment under a false name with a small, highly specialized firm known for handling complex estate and trust litigation, miles away from their usual Lagos circles. She met Miss Eleanor Evans. Miss Evans was a sharp, meticulous woman with silver hair and eyes that missed nothing. Elara laid out the facts: the Caldwell name, the locket, the address, and the strange coincidence of Julian moving them into the house 5 years after Vivian's death. She also mentioned the shell company Julian vaguely referenced for the lease. Miss Evans got to work. She began by researching Vivian Caldwell herself, a task that quickly uncovered the astonishing truth. Vivian Caldwell was indeed born into the family that owned the estate. In the 1950s, she had been the only daughter and heir to the vast Caldwell fortune. However, Vivian had chosen love over lineage, marrying a man her family considered beneath them, and had voluntarily walked away from the wealth. She cut off all contact, maintaining her choice with iron-willed dignity. "But here is the critical part, Miss Vance," Miss Evans said during a tense midweek meeting, pointing to a stack of ancient, yellowed documents. Vivian Caldwell never formally disclaimed her inheritance. She simply refused to touch it or acknowledge it. The family trust, established in 1928, was poorly managed after her parents died. Her name remained on the original document as the sole living heir in the direct line. When Vivian died 5 years prior, without a will and with Elara as her only living descendant, the vast estate, including the house, the land, and the portfolio it represented, reverted directly and legally to Elara Vance. The total value is estimated north of $500 million, Miss Evans concluded, her voice low. "Everything. It's all yours." Elara felt faint. 500 million. It was a dizzying number, an abstract concept that made the marble floors she walked on, the velvet curtains she drew, and the very air she breathed suddenly change composition. The shell company Julian used? It was renting the property. When Vivian died, the trust's executors, unaware of Elara, had simply leased the property to a holding group, Julian S. Company, for short-term revenue while they sorted out the tangled ownership. Julian, realizing the house was vacant and available for corporate lease, had seized the opportunity, using the Caldwell name, his wife's name, to live a fantasy life he couldn't afford. He had never owned the estate. He had only been a tenant, squatting on his own wife's inheritance. Elara took a deep breath. How long to finalize the transfer and make it indisputable? 3 months, Miss Evans stated firmly. It must be ironclad. We need patience. You must do nothing. Say nothing. Just wait. The 3 months that followed were an exercise in perfect, agonizing self-control. Elara had to become a ghost in her own house. She returned to the mansion that evening with a secret so monumental it felt like a physical anchor inside her. She was no longer just Julian Thorne's wife. She was the sole legal owner of everything he believed made him important. Vivian's voice echoed in her mind. Silence makes them overplay their hand. Elara watched the dissolution of her marriage like a silent film. Julian grew crueler, his coldness a palpable barrier between them. He stopped pretending to care, coming home only to sleep or not at all. He felt secure in his control, secure in the knowledge that she had nowhere to go, no resources of her own, and no family to rely on except the memory of a woman from a tiny Ogun State house. Her goal was simple: survival and observation. She had to stay until the paperwork was filed, until the lease was formally dissolved, and until the ownership transfer was recorded in the county courthouse. A transfer Julian would never see coming, because he never knew the history of the house, let alone her connection to it. The real conflict began when Julian stopped hiding the affair. Sienna was suddenly everywhere, a glittering brassy fixture in the house, moving her possessions into Elara's dressing room, leaving cheap cloying perfume on the pillows. Elara saw it all. She felt the sting of every public snub, every whispered phone call, every piece of evidence left out in the open. She had 3 months to endure their contempt, but she knew the cost for them would be exponentially higher. Her silence was not surrender, it was a strategy, a tightening coil. She remembered the look in Miss Evans's eyes, a mix of awe and grim satisfaction, when she handed Elara the finalized trust documents that first day. "You are a quiet woman, Miss Vance," Miss Evans had noted. Many clients would have confronted him immediately. "There is nothing he can say that will change the truth," Elara replied simply. "I want the truth to speak for itself, when it can no longer be denied or undone." And so she waited, the gold locket, now open, its message internalized, tucked away in her cedar chest. The woman who had been slapped and mocked was now the architect of the grandest, quietest reversal of fortune Lagos had ever known. The coldness from Julian intensified as the 3-month mark approached. He treated Elara as furniture, necessary but unnoticed. He talked over her at the few social events they attended, introduced her vaguely, and barely remembered her drink order. He was building his new life while still occupying the stage of the old one. The daily torture, however, was orchestrated by Beatrice Thorne. Beatrice seemed to view Elara's quiet resignation as an opportunity for sport. She would arrive unannounced, bringing Sienna along, and critique everything Elara did. "Look at this flatware, Julian," Beatrice said one afternoon, clicking her long, manicured nails against the antique silver. "It's barely polished. You'll need to hire a real housekeeper, not just a quiet companion." Sienna, standing beside her, giggled into her hand. "She doesn't want to get her hands dirty, Beatrice. Too delicate." Elara, who had been meticulously researching property deeds in the study moments earlier, simply nodded, picked up a polishing cloth, and began to work on the silver. She let them believe their words had power, that her dignity was breaking. The most painful incident occurred 2 weeks before the eviction. Beatrice, having discovered that Elara had been looking into postgraduate education, cornered her in the kitchen. "You really think you're going to enroll in a master's program?" Beatrice scoffed, sipping tea from a delicate teacup Elara had purchased herself. "You'll just waste Julian's money and quit after 2 weeks. You have no drive, no spark. You're a placeholder, Elara, a woman Julian chose when he didn't know his own worth." She set the teacup down sharply. "You are weak. And frankly, Julian needs a woman who can keep this house sparkling, not one who stares out windows all day." Beatrice had misjudged her. Elara was not staring out the window. She was watching the legal filings update. The initial papers, the formal dissolution of the company lease, were already moving through the system. Elara simply straightened up, looked Beatrice in the eye, a quiet, steady gaze that seemed to pierce through the woman's self-absorption, and said, "I assure you, Beatrice, I am preparing to start a new life, and I will not require Julian's money for it." Beatrice laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "You and your little Ogun State House, go run a lemonade stand, dear. That's your speed." Elara let the insult hang in the air, a future ghost they would both remember. The only thing she allowed herself was to note the names of the friends Beatrice mentioned hosting at a future garden party, storing the detail away as another piece of necessary information. The plan was not just about ownership, it was about the perfect reveal. The arrival of Sienna's pregnancy was the final, devastating blow Julian wielded, believing it would crush Elara completely. It wasn't a secret Sienna kept. She announced it dramatically during a dinner Julian hosted for a few high-profile colleagues. Elara sat at the head of the table, silent, serving the meal she had prepared. "Julian, darling," Sienna purred, resting her hand protectively over her slightly rounded stomach, "I know this isn't the best time, but I wanted the people closest to you to know. We're having a boy." The announcement was met with gasps and then a rush of congratulatory shouts from the guests. Julian beamed, basking in the glow of his virility and the public confirmation of his choice. He raised his glass to Sienna, pointedly ignoring his wife. "To our future," he declared, "a future free of mediocrity." Elara kept her expression neutral, holding the serving dish steady. She saw the relief and the greed in Sienna's eyes, the certainty that she had won. She saw the smug superiority on Julian's face. He truly believed he had leveraged his way to a better life, discarding the quiet Elara for the more flamboyant, ambitious Sienna. This was the height of their disrespect. They were parading their infidelity and the resulting consequence within the walls of her own legal property. Elara, remembering Vivian's lesson, found a strange sense of calm. The higher they built their pedestal, the farther they would fall. The following morning, Julian informed her of the eviction. "The divorce papers are filed," he said, standing in the doorway of the study. "The house is being renovated for Sienna. You need to be out by Friday. My mother will handle the logistics." He gave her no further details, no discussion of assets, no promise of separation payments. He simply presented it as an immutable fact. That night, alone, Elara did not weep or pack. She walked through the grand, silent rooms of the Caldwell Estate. She ran her hand over the carved mahogany railing of the staircase, a piece of wood that had stood solid for over a century. She stared at the expensive, heavy curtains Sienna had ordered for the master bedroom, the ones Sienna would only enjoy for another few nights. At 2 a.m., she sent Miss Evans a single short email. "It's time. Finalize everything. Proceed with the transfer of the lease and the recording of the trust agreement." The next morning was the day of the public eviction. Elara allowed Beatrice's slap, Julian's meager $500 offering, and Sienna's cruel toast. She allowed them their moment of victory. They had earned it with 3 months of relentless self-exposure and arrogance. Elara packed her cedar chest, the leather folder clutched tight, and drove away. She had endured the darkness. Now she was ready for the dawn. 2 weeks passed. Elara stayed in a quiet, anonymous extended-stay hotel, focusing on the future. The estate was legally and financially hers. The last administrative hurdle, the formal dissolution of Julian's shell company's lease, had been executed the morning after her eviction, meaning Julian and his family were now trespassing on her land, blissfully unaware. She spent those 2 weeks meeting with Miss Evans and the rest of the legal team. They were preparing for the main event, not a courtroom drama, but a public, undeniable declaration. Elara also visited a high-end tailor. The resulting suit was a tailored Chanel wool crepe, pristine white, structured and strong. It was the antithesis of the quiet, faded dresses she wore while living in the estate. It was armor. Meanwhile, at the Caldwell Estate, Beatrice was hosting the party of the season. The event, ostensibly a garden cocktail party, was actually Beatrice's triumphant relaunch into Lagos's elite society, cementing the Thorne name and celebrating Julian's acquisition of a wealthy, beautiful baby mama. Beatrice had invited 200 of her closest acquaintances, ensuring maximum social impact. Elara watched the news coverage online from her hotel room. A local society blogger was live-streaming the setup. White tents, crystal glasses, and a full orchestra tuning their instruments on the back lawn. Beatrice had spared no expense. "The timing is impeccable, Miss Vance," Miss Evans confirmed over the phone. "They are all there, every witness we could possibly need." Elara felt a cold, focused determination. She put on the white suit, the fabric stiff and perfect. She did not wear the gold locket. She wore nothing but the clothes and the knowledge. At 5:15 p.m., the black Maybach, chauffeured and impossibly sleek, pulled up to the curb of 14 Lecky Gardens Drive. The gates were wide open, welcoming the guests. Elara, flanked by Miss Evans and 2 stern-looking private security guards, stepped out. The contrast between her quiet, disgraced exit 2 weeks ago and this dramatic, authoritative arrival was stark. The garden party was in full swing. Beatrice, standing on a makeshift stage, microphone in hand, was in the middle of a self-congratulatory speech. "And so, tonight, we celebrate the Thorne future." Beatrice's voice boomed over the speakers. "We celebrate knowing your worth. We celebrate not settling for less, but demanding the best. And frankly, we celebrate this gorgeous home that is finally being occupied by the family it deserves." Just as Beatrice raised her champagne flute, the music, which had been a low, elegant hum, abruptly cut out. The sound system emitted a high-pitched squeal. 2 security guards, dressed in dark suits, had silently moved past the caterers and unplugged the main sound board. 200 heads turned, following the guard's line of sight, and saw the unmistakable figure standing at the edge of the manicured lawn. Elara Vance. A hush fell over the 200 guests. Faces went from confusion to recognition to stunned disbelief. Beatrice, frozen on the stage, lowered her flute. "Elara, what are you doing here? Get out. This is private property." Elara, walking slowly but steadily, started across the lawn. Miss Evans followed directly behind her, carrying a slim, official-looking briefcase. Julian, who had been chatting near the bar, saw her and turned white. He started forward, his handsome features contorted with anger. "Elara, I'm calling the police. You are not allowed here." Elara did not acknowledge him. She walked until she was directly in front of the stage, looking up at Beatrice. Miss Evans stepped forward, taking the microphone from the stand the security guards had commandeered. She tapped it once, checking the connection. "Good evening, everyone." Miss Evans's voice was calm, professional, and loud. "I apologize for interrupting your celebration. My name is Eleanor Evans, and I represent Miss Elara Vance, who is currently standing on her own property." A wave of confused murmuring swept through the crowd. Beatrice found her voice. "Her property? Are you mad? This is the Caldwell Estate. It belongs to Julian's company." "It belongs to Miss Vance," Miss Evans stated without raising her voice. She opened her briefcase and pulled out a heavy sheaf of documents. 2 weeks ago, Miss Vance was publicly evicted from this house by Mr. Julian Thorne and his mother, Beatrice Thorne. She was offered $500 to walk away. Miss Evans held up a document. Effective 3 months ago, upon the death of Vivian Caldwell, the sole beneficiary of the Caldwell Family Trust, Miss Elara Vance, inherited this entire estate, including the property at 14 Lecky Gardens Drive, valued at over $500 million. The murmuring stopped. It was replaced by a dead silence, broken only by the chirping of birds in the oak trees. Julian finally reached the stage, breathless. "That's a lie. My company has the lease. I signed the papers." "Mr. Thorne," Miss Evans said, looking directly at him with pity, "your company's lease was dissolved by the true owner 3 months ago. You merely used the property as a temporary shelter, a rental you were no longer authorized to occupy. Miss Vance signed the transfer papers the night before you threw her onto the street. The house, Mr. Thorne, has been hers for 5 years, ever since the death of her grandmother, Vivian Caldwell. The name on the gate is her name." Sienna, who had been watching from the balcony railing, suddenly looked ill. She gripped the rail, her celebration replaced by raw fear. Elara finally spoke. Her voice was quiet, so measured that the guests had to strain to hear it, lending her words an undeniable power. She looked at Julian, her eyes clear and unreadable. "3 years ago, Julian, you told me I was the kindest, most graceful person you had ever met. Then you moved me into this house, the house that was legally mine, and called it your achievement. You didn't even know the owner's name was my grandmother's name." She paused, letting the irony settle. "You called me a charity case. You had your mother slap me, and you offered me $500 to walk away from my $500 million inheritance." She turned her gaze to Beatrice, who was swaying slightly on the stage. "Beatrice, 2 weeks ago, you stood on this porch, on my porch, and struck the owner of this house because you believed she was insignificant. You moved Sienna into the master bedroom," Elara continued, gesturing toward the mansion. "She picked out new drapes. She planned renovations. Every room she touched, every curtain she ordered, every space she celebrated as her victory, belonged to me. The irony is staggering. The assembled guests, bankers, socialites, lawyers, and CEOs, were not just watching drama. They were watching a complete financial and social execution. They understood power, and the quiet, tailored woman standing before them was the very definition of it." Elara stepped back, allowing the legal team to take over. Miss Evans walked toward Julian, followed by the 2 security guards. She held up 3 envelopes. "Mr. Julian Thorne, Miss Beatrice Thorne, and Miss Sienna," Miss Evans announced. "You are hereby served with a formal notice of eviction. As of this moment, you are trespassing. You have 72 hours to vacate the premises. You may only take items that you personally brought with you. All fixtures, appliances, and furnishings provided by the Caldwell Family Trust remain with the estate." Julian crumpled. The reality hit him with the force of a wrecking ball. The wealth, the house, the standing. It was all a lie, a facade he had leased, and now the lease was up, with astronomical consequences. Sienna shrieked from the balcony, a high, panicked sound, and ran back into the house. Beatrice began to cry, but they were tears of impotent rage. She grabbed Julian's arm. "Do something. Call someone." Julian could only shake his head, staring at Elara, the quiet wife he had dismissed. Elara watched for a moment longer, allowing herself the smallest, most private smile. She did not need to fight, nor did she need to shout. The truth, backed by the law, was loud enough. She turned, walking back toward the Maybach, leaving the chaos she had created to run its natural course. The party disintegrated instantly. Guests, realizing they were witnesses to a massive scandal, scrambled for their cars. Beatrice screamed at Julian. Julian shouted at Miss Evans, and Sienna began throwing things out of the master bedroom window, hysterical. The police arrived quickly, called by a terrified guest, but Miss Evans calmly presented the deed and the recorded trust agreement. The police officer, recognizing the signature of the chief judge, simply told Julian and Beatrice they had to comply with the eviction notice. The consequences were immediate and severe. Julian's public scandal, the televised footage of his wife's eviction, followed by the public serving of his own eviction notice, was a catastrophic professional failure. His company, which prided itself on prestige and stability, fired him before the sun set the next day. The shell company that leased the house vanished, as did the corporate life it represented. Sienna, the gold digger who had celebrated the downfall of her rival, saw her future evaporate in a single moment. She found Julian sobbing in the foyer, surrounded by eviction notices. "You didn't even own the house," she spat, her voice laced with venom. "You promised me this life. I'm pregnant with your son, and we're going to be homeless." She didn't wait for the 72 hours. Sienna packed 2 designer bags and was gone by midnight. She left a brief, cold note. "My lawyer will be in touch about child support. Don't call me." 2 weeks later, she was photographed by the same society blogger, dining with a wealthy cardiologist. Beatrice's ruin was slower, but more agonizing. Her social standing in Lagos was utterly destroyed. Her friends, terrified of association with such public disgrace, stopped taking her calls. She was voted off her charity board, and her exclusive club membership was revoked due to a clause referencing conduct unbecoming of a member. She was forced to sell what assets she had left to pay off Julian's debts, eventually moving into a tiny, poorly ventilated apartment on the unfashionable side of town. Julian, blocked by Elara from the estate and all its funds, descended into poverty rapidly. He found a studio apartment, small, cramped and dingy, a universe away from the mansion. He took a job selling furniture at a discount showroom. He was haunted by the memory of Elara's calm face and the $500 he had offered her. Elara watched the news reports from her temporary housing with a quiet detachment. She felt no malice, only the deep satisfaction that comes from having the truth prevail. She had simply let them destroy themselves with their own arrogance. She had provided the rope, they had tied the knot. A few months later, Elara Vance became known across Lagos as the quiet heiress. She refused all interviews, issuing only one statement to the press, confirming the details of the trust and the fate of her ex-husband. She decided to honor the woman who had truly given her the fortune. The vast Caldwell Estate was not turned into a private palace. Elara established the Vivian Caldwell Foundation. The mission: to provide resources, education and housing for young women from rural communities, helping them gain access to higher education and professional opportunities in Lagos. The estate, once a monument to stagnant, inherited wealth, became a place of dynamic purpose and legacy. The new sign on the gate read, "The Vivian Caldwell Foundation, Character over Wealth." Julian, finishing a grueling Saturday shift, selling cheap sectionals, drove past the estate on his way home. He slowed his beat-up car, pulled over to the shoulder, and just watched. He saw the foundation sign. He saw young women laughing as they walked across the lawn, carrying books instead of designer handbags. And then he saw Elara. She was walking out of the front door, wearing a simple but elegant dress, laughing with a group of the students. She looked radiant, fulfilled, and completely at peace. She was no longer quiet out of resignation, but out of power. Julian remembered every lie, every sneer, every piece of cruelty he and his mother had inflicted. He remembered the feeling of superiority as he'd watched her leave with her cedar chest. He hadn't just lost a wife and a house, he had destroyed his own life, throwing away a life of grace and $500 million for a cheap affair and a momentary ego boost. He realized with gut-wrenching finality that Elara's silence had been a greater strength than any shouting he could ever muster. Days later, Elara drove to Ogun State. She visited her grandmother's grave, a simple granite marker in a small, peaceful cemetery. She took the gold locket from her pocket and placed it on the stone. The metal glinted in the afternoon sun. "The time was right, Granny," Elara whispered, touching the cool stone. "You taught me how to wait. You taught me the difference between fighting for attention and standing on the truth." She stood there for a long time, the wind rustling the leaves. Her victory had not been in the confrontation or the revenge, but in the patience and grace that had allowed the undeniable power of the truth to speak for itself. Elara turned and walked away, not toward a fortune, but toward a purposeful future, carrying Vivian's legacy forward. The quiet ones, she knew, were the ones to watch.